Hi, and welcome to this demonstration of the FreeRTOS task notifications demo. I'm Norman McIntyre. I'd like to thank Young for requesting this demonstration. And I'm going to enable task notifications. I'm using the STM32CubeIDE. And your first step, if you want to use task notifications, is not always clear. You need to go to the config parameters, and there's something called use task notifications. It's actually disabled by default, so you want to make sure you enable that. This is under your FreeRTOS configurations, and once you enable that, then save your configuration, and it'll say, do you want to generate the code, and you'll say yes. Alright, so that's how you get started on this. Let me switch over to my actual environment and I'll show you what I've got running, and then we'll talk about the code. So here you see the code that we're going to talk about is running right now. I want you to observe we have a default task that is printing to the screen every second, and I want you to notice we have a task 2 that actually waits for 5 seconds to get a task notify. And if it doesn't get that task notify within 5 seconds, it just returns and then prints out the message and does it again. However, I have my interrupt service routine connected to my blue button. Watch what happens when I touch the blue button. So we're waiting for it, I touch it. Notice we get the callback. I'm touching it, and you can see every time I touch the button. So we get the callback, and when we get that callback, we get the return. So this is a great example. It's probably one of the more common ways of using the task notification is from an interrupt service routine. And so I just press the blue button, boom, and right there we notify, in this case, our task 2 that the interrupt came in. So now I want to switch over to the code and let's see what's going on. So over in my code, the first thing I want you to notice is I'm going to come over here to my project, and right here where it says this is where we basically use the graphical interface to configure everything. I'm going to double click on that and say yes, I want to change the perspective. And this puts us back to that original graphical interface where we can configure things. They call it the configuration tool. And over here at the configuration tool, I want you to notice if I go to middleware and I go to the FreeRTOS, and under this FreeRTOS, notice under config params, so the area, the config parameters, I've got all these different ways, and if you scroll down, you'll see under the kernel settings, the one we're wanting, enable task notifications. So notice you just click on that and you can either enable it or disable it. It's disabled by default, so I have enabled it for this. Now I've already done this previously, but if you were doing this for the first time, you could then save this and it would regenerate any code. And of course that means if you went and you set timers and all these other things, it could regenerate code. But right now I'm focused just on this use the task notifications. Alright, next place I want to go is to my main code. And in my main code, I want you to notice when I start up, I send out this, use the how UART transmit to give a startup message. And then I create 2 different tasks, my default task and the task I call task 02. So start both of those up, and we'll look at them in just a minute. Before we do so though, I want you to notice I also have an interrupt service routine. We talked about interrupt service routines, and this is coming from when you press the button. It calls this, and if I detect that the button has been pressed, then I do this notify. Now, a common mistake people make is instead of using task notify give from ISR, they will call task notify give. And it's important to recognize anytime you're in an interrupt service routine, you should use this from ISR version of the call. In fact, if I uncomment this and put this in its place, we'll see that our code will actually hang just by calling this. It'll hang because we're calling it inside a interrupt service routine, which we do not want to do. Alright, so that takes care of that. Now let's go over to the in the main. Notice how I use this to navigate. So I'm going to come down here and navigate to my start default task. And in the start default task, I want to draw your attention here. I just print out the message that I'm in the default task. I use my how UART. I'm not using my printf because from an earlier video we know there are issues about using the different stacks for that. So I'm just going straight down to the UART. And notice the default task will delay for 1 second. Alright, now my other task, the one we're more interested in, the start task 2. Alright, so here in our start task 02, notice I come down and I print out this message, task 02 waiting 5 seconds for TaskNotify. And so what it does is comes down here and says I'm gonna wait up to 5 seconds to get a TaskNotify. And when it returns, I've got this if statement that'll tell us whether the TaskNotify came back as a 0 or whether the TaskNotify came back as a non-zero. And so if I wait for 5 seconds, I don't get the notification, I just come back. Otherwise, I'll return early. And we'll look at how this value changes based on whether you return early or not. Now remember how we return. Let me go down to my interrupt service routine. So when I press the button, I have, by pressing that blue button, we get called here. This is the low-level interrupt code. Notice this in this STM32L4XX_IT, IT for interrupt. And this is a generic interrupt handler, handling interrupts 15 through 10. And it actually calls this here. And so if I click and say open declaration, I want you to notice that this one, when it calls this, it checks to see if we've got an interrupt, and if so, it does this callback right here. Now the callback we see is right here, but it's weak, and weak means you can replace this somewhere else in your code, and then this code would not be used. And so I took advantage of that. What I did was copy this prototype, and then I went over to my main, and in my main I said, well, I'll put it just for convenience to help us see what's going on. I put it right here under main. I paste it here, remove the weak attribute there at the front, and so when I call in here, when this gets called, I check again to make sure that it's my pin, it's the blue button, and if so, I give this message that I've got the callback. And notice again, it's important to note, I'm doing the TaskNotify give from ISR. If I use the normal one, I would hang at this point. Alright, so having said all that, let me click on my debug. And yes, we want to switch perspective. And we hit what's our now familiar breakpoint. Before I say continue running, notice down here, I'm no longer running, right? My board is stopped. In fact, the first thing we should see is a starting up message. So here goes. Let me say resume. And notice we have our default task. First we see our startup message here. Our default task, we're running, and notice every 5 seconds we get task 2 telling us it's waiting. And then I'll press the blue button. Boom, boom, boom. And of course every time I press the blue button we get this notification that we've been notified. So great example of task notifications. I recommend you try this same code and get it running on your system as well. I'm Norman McIntyre. Thanks as always for watching.